Hey, Waptors, Mr. Lassiter here, and we're going to go ahead and get started with our review tonight. Hopefully the sound will work for you. The chat is open, so feel free to ask any questions you have. I will be starting by going over some of the questions from the Kahoot. About 31 people took the Kahoot test or quiz, and I have to just start with congratulating Lucy for the top score, Caroline a good second place, and Jonathan for third. A lot of really good scores on here. None of y'all could beat my score, which I made the thing, or I edited the thing, so of course that makes sense. But some really good results. These were some decent practice questions. Obviously not in the AP test format, but some good idea or some good ideas for stuff that is important and will show up or might show up on the test. And so I just edited a teacher's quiz they had created on Kahoot, and I thought it made for a little bit of fun on snow days. So I'm going to start with just some of the questions. I don't know if you can go back and review your questions, but you should be able to in the Kahoot app. You can go back and take a look at the quizzes that you've taken and at some of the questions, so you can kind of follow along here if you would like. I'm going to mainly go through, I don't know if I can find what I did with it, the questions that were missed by a majority of students. And so the first one was looking at question 4. It's pretty straightforward. It said the center of the Safavid Empire was the modern day state of, and it's Iran. So keep that in mind. We're thinking about where these Islamic gunpowder empires are. The Ottoman Empire, excuse me, predominantly in Anatolia, or that's its center. It had expanded into, of course, southeastern Europe, and it controlled large portions of the Levant. The Safavid Empire in Iran, and then the Mughal Empire of India. So that's the first one that I wanted to review. The second was question number 6. Which of the following states fell back from European ascendancy following the religious wars in Europe that had come about following the Reformation? Now, obviously, that wasn't all packed in. There's a lot packed into that question. There's actually limits on how long these questions can be. So it's asking which European state went from kind of its height and actually kind of fell backwards, so to speak, as a result of, or in the years following these religious wars, which occurred in the late 1500s, early 1600s, or in the late 1500s as a result of the Protestant Reformation. And the correct answer there is Spain. So your options were the Netherlands, the Dutch, but they're going to really come into their own and start expanding their trade as the Dutch East India Company comes into being, joint stock company. They will eventually, in the early 1600s, they capture, and I looked this up, somebody asked this question the other day, and I didn't have a full answer for it. I'm reading from the review book here, or a review book. The Dutch captured the city of Malacca, that important city the Portuguese had brought under their control. So they captured that from the Portuguese. They built a fort at Batavia on the island of Java. Of course, those are with an island in a city that you know from your geography test. They built a fort there in the year 1620, and from Batavia, the Dutch attempted to monopolize the spice trade. And we even read a source about that in dealing with the global flow of silver. The British were lamenting the fact that they had lost out on the spice trade. The British instead focus on India and textile production there. But the Netherlands did quite well. France, of course, would continue to expand They would expand eventually into Southeast Asia, of course, into the Americas and Britain as well. So Spain is the one that really falls back. Remember, they're reaping the benefits of this massive influx of silver, but eventually their economy falls apart. So that was one of the more missed questions. Another one, question 11, excuse me. What was the primary reason for the closing of Japan from foreign influence? Now, the answer choices here were not my favorite. In fact, I went back and edited them for next year. The correct answer is that they feared that they would be treated the same way as the Americas. In a way that might be a little misleading. You might have expected to see the Philippines, right? It's something I said. They didn't want to be taken over by Europeans. That was the primary reason why they closed themselves off from foreign influence. Most people chose a desire to protect native Japanese culture, and that, I think, was a secondary concern. Of course, if you shut out these other places, that culture will be protected. But they didn't want these Europeans to come in and subjugate them somehow. Next year, I've changed that response to the Philippines to make it a little bit more clear. And that was probably why maybe you didn't recognize that. But yeah, the Japanese, they feared this perhaps loyalty to a Christian pope as Jesuits were gaining more and more converts. They certainly did not want Europeans to have economic control over their territory. Question 15, innovations in art like Renaissance art, miniatures, woodblock prints were encouraged in this time period due to which of the following. And again, this is one that I changed, but I don't think it showed up for you. I went to change it after I had taken this as a practice. One of the reasons why we see these innovations in art is because there is an increase in the available funding for it. So as these countries in Europe engage in more trade and become wealthier, you can actually be patrons of the arts. We see the same thing in some of our other empires. Certainly there was a desire to demonstrate power. So question 15 is, there are a couple of answers there that I think are viable. And between those two, 92% of you chose those. So I thought I'm not too worried about that. Moving on, question 27 has to do with Zheng Ha, the Chinese sailor. Although he technically falls in period 3, Zheng Ha's naval voyages into the Indian Ocean served to do what? And the correct answer was to enhance the prestige of the Chinese Navy during the early Ming Dynasty. Remember, that was the success of Zheng Ha's voyages. Eventually, he was recalled, though. He does not, the next most chosen answer, which is not correct, is that it does not establish long-term Chinese dominance in the Indian Ocean trade. Remember, because he is recalled and the Chinese basically shrink from their dominance in the Indian Ocean. So they do not have long-term dominance in the Indian Ocean. Excuse me. Between 1500 and 1750, what was the primary role played by Europeans in the Indian Ocean? Question 28. Remember, Europeans in the Indian Ocean primarily were moving goods between different ports in the Indian Ocean. So they were just transporting goods from Asian markets to other Asian markets. Of course, that will change as transportation and communication change as well. Question 34, the tolerance of Christians within the Ottoman Empire served to do which of the following? So this is one of those important things to think about with the Ottoman Empire and its tolerance toward different groups of people. Although you could look at the unfair draft system. They had the Devshirme system and say, well, maybe it wasn't completely tolerant. But in general, tolerating Christians within the Ottoman Empire allowed the government to legitimize its authority by including local peoples. So even if they controlled Christian communities, for example, in Southeastern Europe, they would still have some form of legitimacy because they weren't oppressing the Christian religion. Instead, they were tolerant of it. So that was question 34. And the last one I wanted to go over, question 37, the increasing power of monarchs and other powerful leaders in this time period allowed political elites to, or caused, political elites to negotiate new power relationships. Remember, as monarchs begin to centralize their power, consolidate power, the nobility, in many of our examples in this class, we see different noble groups rising up and people's roles changing. They had to figure out how they fit into the system. In some ways, they had to give up power. In some ways, they tried to find other ways to maintain some form of power. So those were the questions that were the most missed, I would say. If there's anything that you missed that I didn't go over, just make sure to take a look at it, or if you have a specific question, you can ask it in this review. So that took about 10 or so minutes. We'll probably spend about 20 more minutes in review, and I'm going to try to avoid some of the topics that I covered pretty heavily in our last session. So if you miss the hour or so I spent on Wednesday prepping for a test that never came, you may want to take a look back at that. So I'll make some notes, and or I'll make sure to make mention if you miss anything, or if I skip over any questions. Let's see. I'm pulling up a little bit extra information on my end, and let's take a look at your questions. All right. Oh, Moad's back. Thanks, Moad. I do like that framed picture. I've not seen the new cookbook. Lucy asked questions, not wanting to be treated like the American. Oh, in reference to the question earlier about the Japanese protection. Yes, they didn't want to be treated. The Philippines was the example I used in class, but they just didn't want that European control. And then, of course, they implement things to protect Japanese culture as well, and bring it back from that influence. Maya asks, could you go over the recruitment and use of bureaucratic elites and also military professionals, and how they were used? Were they used in the centralization of power? Oh, okay, so there's a lot to that. I'm not exactly sure what place specifically you're talking about, but I can go over a little bit of just thinking about the elites that come about in this time period. So we had, of course, existing elite and new elites in this time period. The existing elites that were the best examples are the Mughal zamindars. They were the local leaders who lost a lot of their power as the Mughal Empire under Akbar, and then later found new, more efficient ways of collecting taxes and the like. That had been the job of the zamindars for some time. But their powers kind of is pretty much bypassed. Another example of existing nobility, the European nobility. Those are the hoity-toity nobles that we tend to think about just hanging out in the palace, eventually at the Palace of Versailles. And those nobles remember, there's kind of an eye, and also with the daimyo of Japan, the leaders who are centralizing power want to keep a close eye on them. And so they establish rules about where they can live and where they can go and when they can go and for how long, etc. The new elites that come about in this time period are people like the Manchu in China, right? They come in, they take over China, they establish a new dynasty. They're centralizing a government that's already pretty much centralized. They use the things that already worked in China. They use Confucian-style systems, etc. Other new elites, the Spanish Creoles in the Americas. We'll talk about them a lot in our next time period. Merchants and entrepreneurs in European trading cities. Again, we'll see um, especially as we get into, for example, like the French Revolution, right? The third estate will become more and more powerful as there are kind of new middle classes developing, and that starts in this time period as well. In terms of military professionals in centralization, I think the big example of that would probably be in the Ottoman Empire. We see, I'm trying to think if it's this time period or not. Yeah, the Janissary Corps. And so again, I'll just, I have it right in front of me. So as I was pretty sure I was in the right spot. And luckily I was. So the Ottoman Empire is going to have like a number of reforms. And in our next time period, we're going to see a big one called the name escapes me. I forget whatever it's called. But there's going to be this warrior aristocracy that comes out of the Janissary Corps. Now, the Janissaries were elite forces within the Ottoman Empire, and they would be kind of skilled warriors. They would also be groomed to take on government roles, bureaucratic roles, administrators of new conquered territories, diplomats, tax collectors, and the like. And becoming a Janissary provided kind of a path to raise one's status in Ottoman society. And so people wanted to be recruited into the service because you could kind of raise your standard. And over time, those Janissaries will become more and more powerful and more prestigious, assuming kind of greater roles in the government. And they will, in our next time period, kind of conflict with or have conflict with the traditional sources of power in the Ottoman Empire, people who were more the religious elite. So we'll see this new like military professionals who rise and become a very elite group in the Ottoman Empire take on more and more control. And the reforms, which the name escapes me, I was literally working on something on this yesterday. If you give me 1 second, I will get the name. The Tanzimat reform, which I'm sorry I couldn't think of, kind of process continue as the Ottoman Empire kind of tries to westernize, modernize, and become a little bit more secular. That seems like a lot. I hope I got toward your question and answer. It might be a little bit more than you even need to know for the test. Lucy asks, how did European countries fund exploration during the time period? Good question. So early exploration is funded as kings become more powerful, right? So Portugal centralizes control, and you have a more efficient tax collection system, and you're not fighting wars with Muslims in Iberia. The same thing happens with Spain, centralizing control, collecting more tax than the central bank, or the king's treasury, so to speak. And they were able to fund these large expeditions. Of course, once you start these expeditions, and the Portuguese start getting involved in the spice trade and other trade in the Indian Ocean, the Spanish discover silver in the Americas, they are going to have even more funds to put toward exploration. We'll see the same thing with the British, although they're late to the game. They kind of have to wait for their wars to die down. Same thing with France, they have to kind of wait for the religious wars to die down before they can get involved. And then the Dutch and the British especially kind of pass what the Portuguese and Spanish had done by allowing joint stock companies to develop. So people sharing interests and pooling resources together. And they were granted royal monopolies in this kind of mercantilist system where they, for example, the British East India Company was the only British company that was allowed to control trade in the Indian Ocean. The Dutch East India Company the same way with the spice trade. And so early countries are able to do this. Early exploration is really funded by centralizing power and centralizing tax collection and being able to pull those resources for these causes. Later on, we see with joint stock companies more investment in this exploration and trade. Good question. Major trade networks during this time period. Pretty much everything from our previous time periods is still major. The big one that comes about in this time period, of course, the Atlantic system, which becomes the trade network, the major trade network in the world at the end of this time period, and it'll stay that way until our next. The Silk Road will go into decline, eventually basically ending by the end of this time period. Overland trade just will not be able to keep up with the efficiency of maritime trade. Although we won't say that overland trade disappears completely, because that would be absurd. Of course, it's still important. But as a massive network connecting Europe to China, for example, it will not serve the same role it had in our past time periods. Other trade networks that continue: trans-Saharan trade, trans-Saharan slave trade continues in this time period. Indian Ocean maritime system still continuing in this time period. The Pacific Ocean even picks up a little bit with the Spanish, and that will be in our next time period too. But nothing like the Atlantic system, really. Talk a little bit about tribute collection and tax farming. Yeah, so tax farming is an interesting, it's a term you'll see pop up every once in a while. Tax farming is a process of basically granting, like, basically it would be like private entities. Like, if we, in our country, instead of the government collecting taxes directly from us and then having the IRS follow up in this kind of central federalized agency, if they allowed people to kind of bid for the right to collect taxes in a state or a region or a county. And so the governments would use these kind of private entities to do the bidding of tax collecting locally. In some cases, it worked out, and in some cases that tax farming could kind of break down and be subject to corruption. For tribute collection, I'm not sure exactly what region or place you're talking about specifically. So tribute collection would just be done. Usually we saw it like with China, Ming China. They would pretty much go to an area, show your strength, and say, all right, pay us tribute. We will kind of protect you in this region and trade with you, but you are paying us, acknowledging that we are a stronger nation. We could come in and take you over, but we're going to leave you be self-governing as long as we start reaping some benefits and you respect our role in this region. So the Ming Dynasty would be a good one at the end of the last time period. But of course, China retreats from that. What do you need to know? Oh, I lost the spot. About Alfonso Albuquerque. Nothing specifically. He's a Portuguese leader in India, I think. But his name, I don't think he's mentioned directly in the key concepts. You might see a source related to him, but you'll be given some sort of context for understanding that source. A lot of names come up depending on the textbook you read, or you might read a review book. You might have read one of the reviews that I give you in class. A lot of this stuff shows up in Ways of the World, and the names of these people are important mostly to illustrate broader trends, or to tell or to illustrate for example, the Portuguese control of certain areas of India or something along those lines. But they're not names that you kind of have to memorize every little thing about. They're more so put together in order to tell a story or tell a good story, so to speak. I'm pretty sure I don't have anything in on your test asking like who he was, when he lived, or anything like that. Um, I'm double checking, see if I missed anything else. Yeah, so that's what I would say. Don't get too bogged down in names unless it's somebody like Christopher Columbus. You would certainly need to know. Trading companies, joint stock companies. So you definitely need to know about joint stock companies. I think I lectured on them one day in class. So go back to your notes on that. Joint stock companies are an example of new ways in which governments were, new ways in which the global markets were changing, or global exploration and trade were starting to change. We see mercantilism come into play, and joint stock companies are ways that people can share the extraordinary risk of sending these ships across the ocean. Basically, you can imagine if a single person, let's say a rich merchant who is able to put together a ship, and he's going to bring back tons of spices from the Indian Ocean. You lose one of those ships. Not only do you lose the spices that you've already paid for and waiting to sell, but you lose that ship and the value of the ship, and you lose the men aboard and whatever else you paid them in advance for their families, and you got nothing to reap for it. One disaster like that could ruin you, could put you in debt for life. And so joint stock companies allow people to share that risk. Of course, they also share the rewards, but it protects people from these major disasters. The British East India Company, the Dutch East India Company, those are the two most significant joint stock companies. And at least that you need to know. They compete against each other basically for control of global trade in the Indian Ocean. So that's the big stuff to know. It's a big change in the way trade is done, and it's one of the reasons why Britain and the Netherlands, the British and the Dutch, are so successful in this. Whereas a place like Spain, who basically has a royal control over trade, they're just not going to be able to keep up. Private enterprise is going to be what takes over. And initially, these countries, the countries like Britain and France and the Netherlands, they practice mercantilist policies. They want their colonies to trade only with themselves. They want to keep all this money within their realm, right? They don't want British money going to the Dutch or anything like that. So there's kind of a tighter control over it. Later on, Adam Smith will challenge that idea and argue for the free market, which will eventually win out. Chase asked about labor system. I think I covered that at the end of my video the other day, or my live review session. Labor systems you need to know about, especially coerced labor. The big forms of coerced labor, of course, the Mita system, used initially by the Inca, later by the Spanish, the encomienda system, used by the Spanish, but eventually outlawed because of its brutality. Encomienda was basically a continuation of what the Spanish had done in the Iberian Peninsula. They had, had this process of conquering people, putting them to work, and also like educating them in the ways of the faith, the Christian faith. Well, that system in the Americas was extremely brutal, and was eventually outlawed. It's replaced by the hacienda system, so you can look into that. The indentured servitude, of course, is something that you know about, and chattel slavery. That is that classical slavery that we tend to think about. The introduction and change to slavery is the biggest change in labor that we see in this time period. The widespread use of slavery with the Atlantic slave trade, which grows, of course, with the expansion of cash crop plantations in the Caribbean, especially, but also in the rest of the Americas, Brazil and North America. Predominantly, we're talking about sugarcane production, to a lesser degree, but still nevertheless important, especially in the mid-Atlantic colonies of North America, tobacco production. And then in our next time period, later in our next time period, as a result of the Industrial Revolution and changes with that, cotton production. That really won't be quite as impactful as sugar production. The other type of labor to know is peasant labor, which will increase in certain areas, whether it's Russian increase in peasant labor on the frontiers, settling Siberia, the Chinese using or producing silk with peasant labor for one of the first times. Remember, peasant labor had been predominantly working in fields or working on government projects. Now they're going to be put into silk production or to export more silk and bring in more silver to China. That's another example of peasant labor that we learned about in this time period. All right. Go through a few more. I know we got a bunch here. I'm going to try to go quickly, though. What do you know about the Renaissance? Ooh, good question. Actually, I think in the last video, I actually even put some Renaissance video links out there. For the Renaissance, let me think about what you might need to know. Know what it is. Know, right, that it has to do with new form of art, new studies of science. It challenges some religious ideas, right? It's more so focused on reason. We start to see humanism develop. That's one of the big things that comes out of the Renaissance. Humanism will lead to the Protestant Reformation, naturally. That will be a major change that we see. The Renaissance, of course, is caused by the increased interaction between Europeans and the Middle East following the Crusades. As goods are brought in. Of course, it starts in Europe, or excuse me, in Italy, in Southern Europe, where the Italians, of course, are surrounded by kind of reminders of the classical world. And so this is a rebirth of classical culture. That's what Renaissance means, right? Rebirth of classical culture in Europe. Discovery of new ways of making art and better ways of making art. Yeah, so that's the big stuff. If you take a look at, if you need a quick refresher on the Renaissance, I'd say either go to Crash Course World History or take a look at a video, and I can post it here again. Mr. Guilford made a really brief introduction to the Renaissance video this year for our 9th grade class. And if you're just looking for to cram information about the Renaissance, which is never really a good idea to cram, you probably know enough from what you did last year. I don't think you need to know more than that. But if you want a little bit more information, it is available. If I can find what I did with the video. My computer is slowing down. It might be a battery thing. Give me 1 second. I will find my charger. All right, folks, the magic of live TV. Renaissance overview. Okay, I have a link here. I'll share it with you. All right, so that's down at the bottom there. All right, specific details about diseases, exchange, excuse me, the Columbian Exchange, or just list them. Oh, good question. Well, no, you don't have to know details. This isn't your biology class, right? So measles, mumps, influenza, smallpox, right? Those are the big ones to know. Estimates, most people have settled on about 90% of Amerindians are or die from these epidemics. Of course, the epidemics weaken a lot of these places, especially where the Spanish are able to go in and conquer. So those are the big things to know. Syncretic beliefs and their importance. So we had a few syncretic religions to think about. One, Sikhism, right, that develops in South Asia, a combination of Hinduism and Islam. And then a couple of the others that we talked about in the Americas. There's the development of Vodun in Haiti, in the Caribbean, Hispaniola. Some examples of syncretic beliefs with some blends of the Mexica culture, the Aztec culture, and Catholicism with Our Lady of Guadalupe, a lot of similarities there. Santeria in Cuba. There's the cult of saints in South America. But those are just some more examples of the combination of kind of Christian ideas and traditional ideas of either Amerindian peoples or African slaves, who of course are forced to come to the Americas. So we see a lot of blending of religion in that manner, especially with Christianity. Sikhism in South Asia, of course, you can imagine with the Mughals coming in, the presence of Islam, the continued spread of Islam in the Indian Ocean, and Hinduism, which is indigenous to India. All right. Can I explain the faith mosque? I think the faith mosque is, I'm double checking here. I think I told you about that in terms of Istanbul, or in, I'm trying to think of the context that we talked about that. It was the mosque built after the Ottoman conquest of Constantinople. And one of the things to know about this faith mosque, which if you just look it up if you just search faith mosque, it'll show up on Google, so you can take a look at what it looks like. It was built on the site of a former Christian church where where the Byzantine emperors had been buried. And so when the Ottoman Sultan who conquers Constantinople, Mehmed II, I want to say, it sounds right, but you may have to check the number that goes after his name. After he conquers Constantinople, he builds a mosque on the site, right? A sign of legitimacy of being a Muslim ruler in a Muslim empire, right? Building this mosque. But it's also the site of these Byzantine emperors' burials. And so he is going to be buried. He is also buried there, right? Again, trying to gain legitimacy over the conquered Byzantine people. Kind of a show of this is the new Persian town, but also he is assuming this role as caretaker of the city, as the leader of this once great and future great city. So I think that's pretty much what you know. And I think that was basically the context that I brought it up in. I think so. Did the Macedonians conquer Greece? Not this time period. Moving on. Do you know specific examples of how rulers legitimize their power? Oh, good question. It's always better to have some kind of in your tool chest, so to speak. You'll need to be able to recognize rulers legitimizing their power. Oftentimes it's done through religion. Sometimes it's done by comparing oneself to someone else, a historical figure who may have had great power. Sometimes, as we see with the Ching Dynasty, it is using elements of the culture of people you conquer in a way that benefits you. So coming into China and not getting rid of the Confucian civil service exam or the Confucian bureaucracy, or even Confucianism in general, right? Because by claiming the mandate of heaven and by implementing Confucian ideals and Confucian traditions, you can gain legitimacy in that way, right? By kind of connecting with the local culture and showing people that you're not going to change it. You're just trying to, return China to its former prestige. Those are, I think, just be able to recognize them. And then one's off the top of my head to know about rulers legitimizing their power. The example of the Qing Dynasty comes to mind. The story I just told about Mehmed. and the Faith Mosque and the Byzantine Empire comes to mind now. There's probably a few more. I mean, being able to recognize them is the most important. What do we need to know about concept 4.3 that isn't on AP Worldopedia? Well, I'd have to look at AP Worldopedia, which, first of all, great, making note that it's not a done deal, right? Mr. Henderson has done some great work and has even added some stuff since last year, which is wonderful. But I'd have to look side by side with the key concepts, and I don't think we really have time to do that tonight. So what I would say is, pull up the key concepts that are linked in the PLP and just take a look. I think he even uses the same outline system. So he'll have it labeled like Roman numeral 1, A, B, C, D, and the like. So you can kind of go down that list and see what is listed in there and what's not. If you're unsure, Freemanpedia will cover probably the rest of them if you want just kind of a quick review. But that's something that you'll have to take a look at. Question about the Janissaries. Were Janissaries other religions besides Christianity? That is an excellent question. So I am not sure if other religions besides Christianity were drafted into the Janissary Corps through the Devshirme system, Devshirme. That's how you spell that. I've only seen mention of Christians drafted into it, and it would make sense because the Ottoman Empire was expanding in that time period when they do this in the, of course, late 1400s, early 1500s. They're expanding into Southeastern Europe, where most people would have been Orthodox Christians. And so I don't know the answer to that question. That's a really excellent question. I would have to assume yes. If people were other religions other than Christianity and they were non-Muslims, then yes, they would. Of course, being drafted in the system, many people convert to Islam, right? So you're going to be that conversion to Islam, in fact, would be partially because you're going probably to be educated in some way for certain jobs in this kind of elite corps. And it also would be a way to move up in society. All right. That's a solid question. Do we need a text lecture from each of the empires we learned about? No, that's probably too detailed. Again, just be able to recognize these trends. That's the most important. Do you need to? We need to know what excursions or what countries Peter the Great went to during his excursions in Europe. No, you don't need to know that. Just know generally he went to Western Europe. I think he ends up in the Netherlands at some point. Is there anything you can say about the SAQ will be new tomorrow in terms of the key concept that might be more emphasized than the rest? Change continuity, making comparisons. Ooh, I think you've said it all, Rayal. Those are all possibilities for your SAQ. Yeah, I don't know. Maybe I'll give you even a choice. Who knows? We'll just see. We'll see which ones I come up with. I got to look and see what we did last year, and then see if there's anything else I want to ask. Sometimes I just pick it right before class, so we'll see. Change of continuity would be a really solid one, though. Let's see what else we have. Oh, there's a question that's hidden for some reason. What do we know about the role of women in this time period? So that's actually a really good question. So women's roles in this time period, we didn't look as closely at women's roles as we probably needed to in this time period. We'll do that a little bit more in our next time period, and certainly in time period 6, where women take on, well, we'll just get there, but I don't want to get too. One thing we do see in this time period, which I don't know if I've talked about, or I don't know if you've read about or remember reading about, European men, when they began trading in the Indian Ocean, are going to rely very heavily, especially in Southeast Asia, on women um, in in that region in order to do business. And so, actually, one example of kind of gender roles in this time period that you need to know, kind of um, terms of gender hierarchy, is that in Southeast Asia, women um, were very much involved uh, with trade in Southeast Asia, especially with being merchant. With they themselves took on large roles as merchants, and this was traditionally because men would often be far away from home for times and trade all over the Indian Ocean. So these women would take on greater roles in these societies for trade. And so that's one example that we have from this that I probably have not talked about with y'all at all. Um, we see some family roles changing in Europe, family sizes getting smaller. Um, that's the big ones that come to mind. I'm sure I'm missing something else though. If I think about it, I'll let you know. I'll take a look back through the test and see if there's anything. If not, I'll mention it in class tomorrow. Uh, if you needed to know 5 people from this era, who would they be? Ooh, good question. Um, Geez, I had to break it down to 5 people. This is like this is great. This is like a ranking game. Christopher Columbus, number one. I hate him, but he's important. I would say start with Christopher Columbus in this time period. Know him. Peter the Great. If we're thinking about Russia, right, I would tell you to know him. Japan. I don't know if I can hammer it down to one person. That whole Nobunaga, Hideyoshi, Tokugawa kind of trio. They're all super important. the I'd say, oh gosh, who else would I say to know? The I'm kind of cheating here. I'm looking through my my book that I have in front of me. Akbar the Great in India under the Mughal Empire. Ruled 1556 to 1605. Not that you have to memorize those dates, but really important for centralizing control in India. That could be one to know. Probably Martin Luther. Protestant Reformation is pretty important in this time period. I'd have to go with him, and I'm probably down to one. So maybe like Henry the Navigator, because he helps kick this time period off. That was fun. What a great, fun question. Main difference between Sunni and Shia Islam. So that kind of goes back to an earlier time period. Basic stuff just to know. They split early on over an argument of succession of who should be the leader of Islam, or the caliph, the successor to Muhammad. Splits early on, something that Ali was the rightful caliph, and others thinking that, well, eventually he was in line, but he wasn't the rightful one right away. So the Sunni and Shia split is not that great until we get, it's minor until we get to this time period, right? And we have Ottoman and Safavid conflicts over their borderlands. And so we see that Sunni Shia split intensify. The Ottoman Empire kind of comes out on top. Sunni Islam to this day remains the majority form of Islam. What ought we need to know about the colonization into Oceania that happened during this time period? Nothing really. Just we'll stop in really Indonesia. We'll talk about Australia next time in our next time period. Thank you for the compliments about the channel. Good. I hope it's helpful. Let's take a couple more questions. Peasant samurai revolts. Good question. basically what we see in this time period, we do see a lot of like peasant uprisings in Europe, um, especially kind of associated with like food shortages and the like. Um, I can't think. I don't have any like off the top of my head to bring up. I was going to see if I could find a good example of one. Samurai revolts happen in Japan as reactions against the centralization of Japan. So that's one to know. But the government overcomes those, especially with gunpowder, and then confiscating all the swords, which is a fun thing to do. Let me see if I can find any other better examples for you. I was going to look through. I'm literally looking through Freemanpedia for some examples that might be relevant. I don't know which key concept this is under though, so I'm having a hard time. I would say, yeah, take a look at Freemanpedia, see what you can find here, because you'll find it faster than I will, I'm sure. There's some talk back and forth. That's great to see. And I think I'm caught up with questions. Okay, so I found some examples of, let's see, the samurai revolt. So it comes from the key concept: competition over trade routes, state rivalries, and local resistance all provided significant challenges to state consolidation and expansion. Yeah, so the samurai revolts, of course, against centralization in Japan would be a good example. The peasant riots that occur in war, a lot of those are basically brought about by religious differences, right? After the Protestant Reformation, some peasants who don't want to conform to whatever religion that is being put on them by the state or being controlled. In some areas where serfdom is persisting, it might be resistance against serfdom. The plague pops up every once in a while in this time period. Remember, it hits really big in the last time period, so people are kind of upset about that kind of stuff. Sometimes peasant revolts are just people feeling they have been taxed too much. In China, we see a massive peasant revolt because there's just not enough food in China really to feed everyone, and that's obviously signs that the government is not doing things correctly. So that would be some information on peasant revolts. There's a Wikipedia article that Freemanpedia links to that just has a list of peasant revolts, and there are a lot of them. So I'm not going to go through them all, but there's some reasons why they might have occurred. Really great question though, and good stuff from the key concepts. And y'all are having a pretty good conversation here about, it seems, marriages being, and the role of women in marriages in Europe. So I think that's a good one because I did not come up with that one. So I think that's really good. Briefly, what were the major effects of the Little Ice Age? Ooh, good question. Well, we had the Little Ice Age thing. One that we see is an effect of the Little Ice Age is that, excuse me, that of course the global mean temperatures like drop slightly, but it does mean like shorter growing seasons. So there are going to be challenges because of the Little Ice Age with producing as much food since you have a shorter growing season. This because you're not producing as much food, there are going to be changes in agricultural practices, and even in some parts of like the northern hemisphere, settlements and regions will actually contract, so people will not be kind of out in these hinterlands as much. We'll see like some urban areas shrink, etc. But the change in agricultural practices that will come along are going to be quite significant, because eventually when the things start to recover from the temperature start to recover, people will have these new agricultural practices which will produce a lot of food and will then fuel the growth in population for the Industrial Revolution. Something that also helps with that, of course, is the introduction of food from the Americas to Europe, which will help feed the masses. The potato, of course, being very important to that. Little Ice Age, another effect. I think one of the things I said, look at the effects in Europe from your notes, and then also look at the effects of China. In China, it is one of the contributing factors because of shorter growing seasons and inability to feed the population. One of the contributing factors in the fall of the Ming Dynasty. So those are some big things that we covered. Been at this a little less than an hour, a little bit longer than I wanted to, but you had some really good questions. I know I don't always answer every question to your satisfaction. I try to skip questions that I think are probably a little too specific or that you won't see on your test. So, and I try to focus on ones that I know are in the key concepts and will not just help you on this test, but in the AP exam. I've missed you guys. It's been a long break, a lot of snow days. I know that you've been responsible for a lot of this unit. So the test may seem difficult in some ways, or you might feel fully prepared, or you might not be. Just trust yourself, trust what you know, and remember that you can think through most of these questions, and you will do quite well. The test is looking like 35 questions. I might strike some off the test tomorrow and trade out some of my kind of one-off questions for some of our one or two more stimuluses. So that might be coming your way, but overall, I think you'll do well. We're looking at 30 to 35 questions. All right, that's pretty much it. I hope you have a great evening and get some sleep, because it's almost 9 o'clock now, so you should be in bed like half an hour or something. I don't know. Get some sleep so that you aren't too brain dead tomorrow. We have a 5-day school week, so that'll be a lot of fun. Talk to you later. Have a good day. All that.